Okay, so now that we have that going on, what we're going to do is we're going to move into the graph editor. And the graph editor gives you total control to move the way that the properties for the keyframes kind of behave. And so let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to toggle up the middle layer. We're going to toggle on the time clock because I don't want anything to move. And I'm going to highlight the bottom sphere. Now I can toggle it down and I can get all the properties here and I can see my keyframes for position, but I only want the rows to show that have keyframes on them. So the quick key for that is the letter U. So if you just hit the letter U, it will just show you any of the properties that have keyframes on them, which this one just has position right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and highlight all of these keyframes, shift select them. I'm going to control click and I'm going to choose easy ease for all of these. Okay, just use easy ease. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into what is called the graph editor. But before we do anything else, let's go ahead and save your progress so that you don't lose your project. And you can actually set your After Effects application to save like every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes automatically if you want it to, just so you know. That is going to be in the preferences somewhere. You can look it up. I'm blanking exactly where it is, but it's make sure you're always saving your projects. It's very easy to work in After Effects for 4 hours or 6 hours in a day, and your computer crashes or the application crashes and you've lost everything. So those saving your files incrementally over time is a really good way to go. All right, so make sure you save your project. All right, so now we are going to jump into the graph editor. So you're going to see a lot of options around your timeline workspace down here, and there's a lot going on. Too much for us to ever get into even in a 4-class sequence, but if your like property options in here aren't quite looking like mine, like you have a few less, there is an expander collapse, the layer switches pane. So there's a layer switches pane right here. Nothing we're going to be using today, but you can expand or collapse that. And then this is another expand or collapse option for layers. So you could close both of these if you wanted to give yourself some more space if you're not using those things. I guess I tend to leave mine open. Don't really have a good reason for that. That's just what I do. But anyways, with the bottom layer selected, let's go ahead and go into the graph editor. And your graph editor is right here. It's a little graph chart. And if you click on that, that is going to show you the easing in of your keyframes. So there's a couple of different ways to look at the graph editor. So not this eyeball, but the second one in, choose graph editor type and options. Right now, I have mine on the speed graph. The edit value path is probably the default one, so most likely you're going to be seeing this one pop up. If you don't though, go ahead and go to edit value graph. Okay, so these two lines are representing the X and Y properties of position. So this green line is position Y, and this is representing movement that might go up or down. Well, we don't have any movement that goes up or down. So that's why this line is flat all the way through. The red line, of course, would be your X position, and that is showing movement from left to right on the screen. And that's why we have this lovely little bell curve to show us movement from right to left. So we're actually going to leave these alone, but I wanted to show you your basic properties here. In the position itself, you don't really see the X and Y properties separated. You can separate them for manipulation if you want, and that is right here. So you can see the X and Y position if you wanted to edit those in the graph editor are separated out here for you. If I toggle that back, the position just returns to, a generic position. So for our purposes today, we are going to look at the edit speed graph. So the value graph and the speed graph are probably the two most used in terms of what we're manipulating. And there are reasons for the others, but we're just going to focus on these two today. So let's go ahead and look at the speed graph. Okay, so it looks like when I went into the graph editor, I lost my curves that I wanted to see. And that is because I accidentally, if I click back, I accidentally clicked my keyframes back to this diamond shape, which are the most simple type of keyframe. We're not adding any extra movement to it. It's just a point A to B to C situation. So I'm going to go ahead and I can do this two different ways. So I can highlight them all here and do the easy ease. Or if you are in the graph editor and this ever happens, you can select your keyframes in here and you'll see that you have easy ease right here, easy ease in and out controls. So if I go ahead and add easy ease back to these keyframes in the graph editor, you're going to see that I get my curves back. Okay, so with the easy ease, you can see that, remember, the top circle has nothing. The second one has ease in, easy ease over here, and then ease out. These all just have easy ease. So let's go ahead and just look at the motion as it plays through. You can see each one has a little bit different type of, dynamic movement as it goes back. This one should seem to be the most dull. And then these should be a little bit more interesting to look at. And you can see that, it's really easy to create narrative in motion design almost out of just anything. So even though all we have right now are these circles moving back and forth, once they move along with each other in different ways, a relationship is established between them. So even though these are geometric forms, you can still tell a narrative with the most simple geometric forms, in the sense that you could imagine, that these are, because these are the same things and they're moving a little bit differently, there's already a visual comparison between the two, and there's a variety of movement. So you're going to engage a viewer just by simply having circles move dynamically a little different against one another. So, for example, since these are all the same and they're all moving a little bit differently, you're kind of left to wonder who, because they're visually all the same, they're associated as being the same things, but they move a little differently. If we were to change the color of each sphere and have different dynamic properties, one might say, the top one is very dull, and if we give it a color association like gray, we'll say, oh, this isn't a very exciting circle, right? And then we could give them the most dynamic one, maybe a color of red. So just to kind of stop for a moment and talk a little bit about narrative and how you can tell a story with very simple, shapes and movements on the screen. That's all it is using those elements and principles of design through movement to create a story for the viewer, whatever it is that you're trying to catch their attention with. So anyway, okay, so let's move some of this and see what happens. So if I highlight this keyframe, you're going to see that I get this bar, and let's say I want to pull it in. There we go. So grab that little end of the handle, and all you need to do is just push it in. And instead of having this sort of uniform bell, or not a bell curve, I guess, just a curve. Bell curve is something totally different. We changed the characteristic of this curve, so let's watch the difference now. So you can see when it comes in, it changes a little bit. Now let's make it even a little bit more drastic. The more variation in movement you create, the more kind of drama you create on the screen. It kind of whips a little faster, and it also becomes more of a natural movement that will catch the viewer's eye. So let's see if we can. We're gonna heighten the drama by taking this one then and pulling it in, and you can see that it kind of makes the graph go up, and then my window just automatically adjusted. But let's look at this. Let's look at the movement from point A to point B versus B to C. So we have our typical curve here, and then here we've manipulated this curve to kind of whip around a little bit. So let's see how that behaves versus this curve. It's much more interesting to look at. Now, this all depends on what you're animating, right? It depends on the characteristics you're trying to associate with each asset that you're animating. But it shoots it really fast in the beginning past the other two circles, and then it sort of slows down. So it kind of gives you the idea in terms of a narrative sense that this lower one is quicker, more calculated, can slow down when it needs to, and it might be, the most talented of the three circles in the movement that it's doing. I know that sounds a little bit silly, but this is how you start giving character to, the objects that you're animating, because ultimately that's what you're trying to do with motion design is give character so that you can have narrative. Now, let's pull these handles and do another dramatic whip at the return of the circle to point C. So let's see what this looks like. Yeah, so this is the fun one, right? This is the quick one whipping around. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is it's all relative, right? So if you're creating a composition and you've got a couple of different things going on in regards to motion, this circle only seems quick and calculated in comparison to these slower, duller circles, right? So like if all of them were dancing around, this one wouldn't necessarily seem like impressive if that's what you're trying to convey to your viewer, because they're all dancing around and having the same sort of movement. So that's something to always be thinking about. I mean, you have your assets and your visuals that you're giving to your viewer, but it's that movement in relation to other movements or lack of movement that, tell the story to your viewer, whatever it is that you're trying to convey. And I will, as we go through these tutorials, I will always try to inject as much of that as possible, because it's really the key. I mean, there's the technical stuff, you need the technical side of things to understand how to make the movements convincing and dynamic, but you also need really great assets and the ability to create narrative out of movement as well. All right, so this is the graph editor. It's a really nice tool. Let's go ahead and let's switch the view back to the edit value graph here. And you can see that things look a little different in terms of the curve, and that's just our adjustment in the speed graph. So I think that we are going to go ahead and end this tutorial there. So what I am going to have you do is we're going to go ahead and export this particular composition, and this is what you're going to turn in for the tutorial. So we're going to go to compositions, add to render queue, okay? And then, so down here, there's a couple of different things. The output module, you want to make sure that you have H.264 chosen, RGB. It should be kind of at this by default, but if you have H.264 selected, it really should probably default to RGB and millions of colors. That should all be good. And then we don't have any audio, so you can just leave it as is or put audio output off and hit OK. So we're going to go ahead and render this out. Now it's only an 8-second animation. And so, it's very short. Normally I might have you go through Premiere and like compress what we've done, but there's no need to do that today because it's so short. And actually, I didn't even pay attention to where I saved that. Let's see. That's another thing to pay attention to, is where you are telling your computer to output your animation to. Okay, so have my little video exported. Here it is. And what this should show when you turn it in is just that transition from no easing or bell curve, making curves basically in the keyframe path. You're easing in, easy ease and ease out, and then you going in and manipulating the graph editor. So your third one down should have a much more dynamic movement. And this is really going to be helpful for, all your motion graphic design work going forward, because that graph editor is really the key to making your motion design stand out and look advanced and above and beyond just these sort of typical go-to manipulations that motion designers usually do. So it's definitely going to give you a really nice tool to create really dynamic movement. Okay, so what you're going to do with that 8-second clip is you're going to upload it to Google Drive or YouTube or Vimeo or wherever you upload it to, and you're going to submit a link in Canvas to it. If you use Google Drive, make sure that you set permissions for me to view the submission. I get a lot of Google Drive submissions with no permission to view. And then I leave a note in Canvas saying I can't view it and I don't hear anything. So just get into the habit. You should be in that habit anyways if you're sharing files, in the Google Drive, Dropbox, whatever. They're all the same. They all have permissions that need to be set so that the person you send the link to can view what it is that you're turning in. All right, well, we are going to go ahead and conclude this here. Hopefully, like I said, a quick refresh on keyframes and learning how to use a little bit more dynamic movement. Please reach out if you have any questions. If you have tech issues in the middle of this tutorial that you cannot get past, send me an email. Do not go on a rabbit hole into Google Forums or Reddit or whatever and try to figure it out. Maybe do that for just a few minutes, and if you can't get to it, send me an email. I can usually help you a little faster because, well, I created the tutorial. So, okay, yes. Thank you, and talk to you later. Bye.